Good morning and welcome to Metabolic Mastery. I'm Dr. Marc Humbert. This is Dr. Cameron Garber, and we are pleased to have Daniel Crumback joining us. So he is course representative for Europe and Africa. He is also the director of strategic health and performance. He is a physio, a clinical exercise physiologist, and a strength and conditioning specialist. So he knows his stuff, and we're so excited to talk to him today. So let's dive right in. Just give us a little bit more background on yourself. Tell us how you got here.
How I got to core or how I got to where I am right now.
Yes.
Yeah, how did you tell us your story, I guess.
Yep.
So tell us the backstory. With any hero, we always like to hear their origin story. So tell us your origin story. How did you become the expert that you are?
Uh, yeah, it's been a very interesting life thus far and continues to be interesting, which is good. I started off in the Canadian military in the Army. I did 30 years over two periods. So I originally started off kind of the story that everybody loves with the military is I started off as a trooper in the Armored Corps at the bottom and ended up as the commanding officer of a hospital in Edmonton, Alberta. And I obviously changed trades a couple of times, and luckily enough was recognized for my leadership and innovation abilities, and was selected to become an officer, and then made my way all the way up to retiring as a major back in 2017. During that time, I switched over to a physiotherapy officer and then became a health services officer during that time, and that includes 3 years in Germany, where with the Armored Corps during the Cold War. So I'm kind of seeing what we're seeing right now and kind of chuckling to myself because we already lived through all of that. And I, a tour in Afghanistan. I was the first physiotherapist supporting the troops in Afghanistan, and there was a period of time I was out for about 6, 7 years in which I was in private practice in physiotherapy in British Columbia. I'm a Canadian. And I also was in private practice in Louisiana because I wanted to experience the South. I love the music and the food, so I was the head of outpatients for a hospital in Plaquemine, Louisiana, and I was also the head of two sport physiotherapy clinics in Florida in the Panhandle. So I was in the Destin, Fort Walton Beach area for a year. So I worked my American time there as well. So working football, working baseball, golf, in those positions as well. And then I retired in 2017, moved to China as the head of rehab and performance, working with Chinese Olympic athletes and provincial and national athletes, and also educating all over China. And that included a stint as the external clinic director for the Chinese Olympic team at the Winter Olympics in 2018 in Korea. And then I left China. In fact, it was really weird. I met a girl while I was there, an English girl. That's how I ended up in England, and who was teaching languages in China, in Beijing, and came back to meet her parents and could not go back to China because COVID was announced the next day. And so they canceled my flights home, and I had a full apartment sitting in Beijing. Couldn't go back, so I had to get friends to be able to pack up all our stuff, and I moved to Athens, Greece, and that's when I was the head of science and education for Pinoe, one of our competitors. And I did 2 years in Athens, and then moved to England after COVID ended, where I was instructing physiotherapy and physiology at the University of Chichester for 2 years, and then finally moved up north and now live in Cumbria, just south of Scotland. And I started working with CORE at that point. And it went from being asked to kind of kick in as a couple of the physiologists were on maternity leave to kick in and take calls as a specialist, to being asked to go to Maastricht as a representative for CORE for a validation study, to coming back and saying, listen, are you interested in being our representative for Africa and Europe? And that's how I ended up where I am today, is working with CORE. And yeah, it keeps continuing to change. I have my fingers in a couple of other pies at the same time, but I keep telling myself this is the age I'm supposed to be looking at retirement, but retirement looks boring to me, so I'm not looking that way yet.
Well, it's funny. Cameron and I joke about that all the time. Cameron's like, I never want to retire, right? I always want to. Same
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Hands in a lot of pies.
Yeah, I love to have many irons in the fire and you know, keep my brain going. So yeah, I'm kind of the same way where I don't know that I would uh, ever really want to retire. I'll always want to have something going.
Absolutely.
Well, it's nice to reach a point where you're respected enough in the world that you get calls from all over the place, and they want you involved in major projects, as you know, because you're respected in your field. And so I'm still getting all those phone calls and still doing a lot of international consulting, which is it's really nice. You get to the point where you work your entire life to have that degree of respect, and then you get it and you've got it for a little while. You almost seem a bit bashful about it. You know, like when they asked me to come to China, I was going like, why me? You know, what about my mentors? You know, why aren't you asking them? And the big comment that I always receive is the fact, well, you're a unicorn. You know, it's really hard to find somebody who's a physio, a sport physio, exercise physiologist, strength conditioning, high performance coach, all in one. And you can sniff out problems because of the fact that you kind of know all aspects. So you can understand how to put together teams. And that was one of my taskings in China, was to bring 100 physios and performance coaches to China to work with the Olympic and national teams. And I had to do all the recruiting, interviewing, recommendations, and presentation to the Chinese Olympic Committee on who I was recommending. And it was, yeah, you could have conversations across all those fields and be able to sniff out weaknesses or potential issues with interaction, because there's a lot of silo building that builds in, and part of it's out of fear and part of it's out of pride of their profession. But when you watch it on the ground, you're going, this is not where you should be spending your time, or these people need to integrate more. And that goes through my entire career, has always been trying to get people to work together. Even in the military, I created multiple programs that, you know, every time I received an award in the military, it was always for innovation, and it was always for seeing things not working as well as they should be, and be able to bring the right people together and put together the, you know, the exoskeleton that's needed, but also putting the right people in places and processes in place. And that's always been my major skill.
Nice.
No, I think that's such a valuable skill to have. And it's interesting. There's so many self-proclaimed experts, right? And I think the hallmark of someone that's really an expert is probably asking just those questions, right? Well, why me, right? Wouldn't you want my mentors? And just, I think it's cool to see in a world of self-proclaimed experts, someone who actually is an expert being humble, right?
Right. Well, so many social media experts and things like that claim they've got the answer, but then don't have the education and experience to back that up.
It's getting a little bit mean out there, I'm finding. You know, especially in the physio world, you know, people are
Big
just,
time.
yeah, they're just being bullies out there and not being open to ideas. And if you dare to express a different idea, they just hammer down on them. And I find that it's going to limit our profession significantly if you don't feel that you have the ability to be able to speak and ask questions and not made to feel like an idiot. So I'd rather, I get to be one of those older mentoring guys now, which is kind of nice.
Yeah. Well, totally. When your word carries enough weight that people don't necessarily tear it down or bash you as much, which is a nice position to be in. But I agree with you. It is, you know, the online social media presence of discussing topics often does get mean. If you express, this is my philosophy, often you'll get detractors. And I'm kind of a believer that all methods carry some merit, and it's just, are you applying it in the right way, or are you making false claims? But all methods have some degree of usefulness, and so to tear it down is just not useful. Yeah, Yeah. So that it's really interesting to hear kind of how you got to where you're at and things like that. So we want to know now a little bit more with metabolic testing in particular. Why did you start to incorporate that into your practice? What drew you to looking at VO2, VCO2 testing, flow, and all of those things? Why was that so important in your ability to coach the athletes that you were working with?
It started way back in the early 90s. I had my own private practice in Penticton, British Columbia. In fact, I kind of created a kind of a cult place because it was called the physio joint. I had huge arguments with the professional body about being able to use the word joint instead of a place to hang out, but and obviously a joint, a physical joint. But it was in was in an Ironman town. So a lot of the people I was working with, I had a good reputation in the sport world, were Ironman triathletes, and they're a very difficult group of people to work with. Yeah, I mean, they just don't understand the concepts of load and how to spend their times, and they can't stick to their own. They can't stick with their own programming because they have coffee with somebody else and somebody else is doing like more. So I've got to change my program, so I got to do more. So it was sort of like, I really am interested in being able to support these guys more on a physiological side of the house. So I was lucky enough to live in an area where there was a guy named Jörg Feldman. And Jörg was a Swiss physiologist who moved to British Columbia. And he worked with tons of Olympic athletes, both in the track and field and in Nordic sports as well. And so I reached out to him because I found he was doing really interesting things, and it was really quiet. Like there wasn't too much discussion of this going on at all. So I reached out to him, and I found him to be really supportive of my interests. So I hopped in my car and drove to 100 Mile House, which is the middle of nowhere, and spent 3 days with him on a weekend doing lactate testing. And he was the creator of Lactate Balance Point. I don't know if you guys are old enough to know that one, but it took lactate testing to a new level. So it was just a different protocol, and we did that for years in combination with. At that point, it was really hard to get a metabolic device with O2 and CO2 without having to sell your house. So I started off with and one of the things that I have over my years is I've worked with every company. So I worked with the Cosmed FitMate Pro, and we spent 8 years working with lactate balance point in combination with metabolic analysis to find out that really lactate wasn't providing us with what we expected. Some of the extrapolation of the is very difficult. Plus, the whole theory behind the research behind what they're doing doesn't make any sense either. It really started off with a study of 20 people and picking 4 millimoles out of the hat. So, I've had my 8 years of doing lactates, but that's how I started off with them. And then what came on board after that was the beginning of near-infrared spectroscopy. So I was one of the very first proponents of NIRS by Moxie. I incorporated that, got rid of the lactate, and then brought in O2 and CO2, and found that was just an amazing combination, the two of them together. And then I started noticing respiratory limitations a lot. And I saw a whole bunch of respiratory training devices come up, and going, well, how do they identify the population that needs this? And that's always been a hunt of mine, is the fact that, for me, population identification is probably one of the weakest areas in research. In the physiotherapy world, it absolutely impedes us in supporting really good methods. And the fact is, we're going to take people, let's say, with general low back pain and find out if manipulation works. And you're going, no, that's not how we do things. We identify who responds best to it and identify what that population is. So we still have, I'm in the UK where almost nobody does any manipulation because the research doesn't support it. And you're going, well, just bad research doesn't. He hasn't identified so in our world, it was sort of like, I'm not comfortable with it unless I can identify a population. So I started adding spirometry in, and that it's one thing that I've been well recognized is how to incorporate metabolic data and NIRS data was the number one thing, because the NIRS people promote that it can do too much, that it can provide too much information. Even on the metabolic side, you've got companies that are promoting ridiculous things like the ability to predict your risk of diabetes. It's all this stuff where it's just too much. There's no need to expand beyond what you know your device is capable of. But the one thing was, if without spirometry, you couldn't understand if the problem was a respiratory capacity or capability issue. And I'm the one who started the conversation between the two of them, because of my view was capacity is the volume, and the capability is the ability to use that volume. And the approach to doing respiratory training has to be based upon whether it's a capacity issue or a capability issue. And everybody was coming out with resistive devices, and I'm saying, I'm not seeing people with a huge amount of strength or power issues. I'm seeing people with a lack of volume issues and hyperventilation and now hypoventilation, thanks to all the breathing freaks that are out there right now. And me having to undo so much because somebody studied somebody who does deep water diving and states that we should breathe like that. And you're going, I'm sorry, but that's not breathing when you're underwater.
Yeah. It's fueling a completely different task, right? That's not steady state endurance activity. So why would that be applicable?
Hanging on to a heavy weight in the water and dropping as far as you can is not exercise. It's just being able to tolerate pressures, and you're going, there's different. So I spent my whole career, I think 30 years of doing this, of just going, this doesn't make any sense. And trying to understand people's terminology, because we're constantly fighting wrong terminology.
So true.
So much.
I mean, how often do you have to say, well, this is cardio? And I go, I don't even understand what cardio means. Within the physio world, core has been destroyed by people using whatever the hell it is now, that we're left with the inability to communicate with each other anymore. So, some of my favorites are, obviously, you probably get very frustrated with discussions of aerobic and anaerobic when you go, there is no anaerobic physiology within the human species. We don't have that. We're not a single cellular structure. So, and yet every time you get into the conversations, you have to try and explain your way out of it, because that's the way other people converse. Right. So it's so even I was talking to somebody this morning, and it was sort of like, I'm interested in buying a metabolic device, and I'm going, every time I hear that, I go, Core Cardio Coach is not a metabolic device. It does measure the metabolic system, but it also measures cardiovascular and respiratory. I would like to change the name of it's a physiological testing device that measures 3 definitive structures and possibly more. So it's throughout my career, I've tried to improve terminology and understanding throughout the whole thing, but I've stuck with spirometry, metabolic analysis, and NIRS for probably 10 years now. I've made small changes to my analysis and everything else. But if anybody ever asks me, and they always do, what's the order of things? And I said, you have to start with a CPET. It provides you with 85% of the information. The other stuff is mainly confirmation, like the NIRS, being able to have a different data set of a different structure and be able to compare the results. They interact really well, but it's way down. Like NIRS on its own doesn't provide me, all the answers. In fact, a lot of the answers with NIRS can be wrong, and I always state that. And spirometry only provides me with one metric, which allows me to work off of norms, because I need that for a decision on how I'm going to train the respiratory system if I find a limitation.
So I like that way of looking at it, right? That we're using those 3 different systems. So for some of the listeners who might not be familiar with each of those technologies, Can you just give a brief description of what you're looking for with each? And then how you are looking at limitations? Like, what are the things that you're focusing on and using as cues to guide what you're working on with the client? That's a lot in there, I know. Lots of questions.
You might have to pull me back on task a bit here. So spirometry is nice and simple, even though it isn't. It's so often I instruct people how to do spirometry, and the first 50 times you might as well just throw the data out. For something that's so simple as taking a deep breath in, putting a device in your mouth, and breathing out as hard as you can, you have to be really good at testing people and knowing when the test is accurate. So that is strictly to look at their capacity. And then, of course, you can use things like the GLI, the Global Lung Index, to be able to look at norms for that individual to find out whether they're within norms. You expect your athletes to be in the 85th percentile or higher. So, but it gives you a definitive amount of volume that they can move in 6 seconds. So kind of a total, as well as what can go out in 1 second. And people always are intrigued of how did I come up with the concept of using FEV1 in the first place? So forced expiratory volume was strictly because the fact that some of my guys breathe 55 breaths a minute. So if I want to know what volume they can move in 1 second, because that's realistic at high intensity.
Yeah.
So be able to look at FEV1 for that individual. First of all, you look at your FVC, or forced vital capacity, the total usable lung size. And you look at what they get out 1 second, and from that you can determine whether there's any kind of obstructive issue and whether the capacity is good in the first place. So it gives you an idea whether you're dealing with somebody who may have a lung issue in general. But you also have to I use spirometry to undo people's misconceptions that they have asthma, because they don't. And I'm one of these guys that most exercise-induced bronchospasm is you're out of shape.
Yeah, exactly. Amen.
Yeah, you just can't freaking breathe because they haven't done the testing properly. So I even bring them in, they'll salbutamol and Ventolin, and they've had all these for years. And I will do their spirometry correctly, like they should have done it within the medical system on a pulmonary function test, of doing their tests, applying the medication, and doing another test. And it makes no difference. And what's really nice is you can get them off of potentially damaging steroid-based drugs.
Yeah.
And get them back in the fact and say, but you're not going to leave them there. You're going to say, but we can train this. Right. And the only way to train a true respiratory limitation is respiratory training. They've already done most of the things they need to within their physical training, that they've maximized their limitation. But it's amazing the number of people that have a respiratory limitation that have not a clue. And we're talking elite athletes that want to make that move from 5th place to being on the podium. And you're going, yes, it's right there. And the reason why you have always been where you are is you've maximized your other systems, but you've left that one behind because you haven't concentrated specifically on that one.
So would you equate kind of the similarity of respiratory training to kind of like strength training versus skill development? So you can do strength training and cardiovascular training, but skill development is a whole different thing that's task specific to that sport. So respiratory training is task specific to breathing for your sport. Is that an accurate way of saying that?
I would agree, but remember where skills training sits on the pyramid. Right.
Top of the pyramid, yeah.
Yeah. And if you go there, you've skipped the bottom. And if 100%. This is where you've got the physio mixed in. I'm using SFMA discussions here. And I'm using my strength and conditioning discussions because without mobility, you can't build strength through range.
Right.
So if it's a mobility issue, thoracic rib issue, let's say, that's limiting the mobility of the cage to allow the diaphragm to move, or whether they've just done a lot of work with breath holds and they've stiffened the diaphragm so it can't move through range. These are two different problems. And again, Do we get everybody to do this? No, you do a test, and I use the SFMA rotation extension. So this is where the physio side comes out, and be able to say, okay, if they score 80 degrees bilateral in 2 different positions, then I don't need to work on mobility, the thoracic spine. So they don't get that. And this is where these generalized programs drive me crazy. People don't have time. You're wasting their time. You're not being specific. And I have a statement that, just don't be an a-hole. Like, do your freaking job professionally, identify what they need to do to get better, and don't generalize, make it individualized and specific. So what's nice about, you do the spirometry and you go, this is what I expected a bit, because you'll start to pick up who you'd expect it to be with. And then you can't make the assumption that just because they have that limitation during a spirometry test, that it's going to equate to a certain output when they're moving, because some people just really suck at doing a test, but they get tense during a spirometry test, and you can see what's happening. But without that data, you don't know. And then if the fact is that they have thoracic stiffness or diaphragmatic stiffness and they don't have the mobility, what does 90% of respiratory training devices do?
Increase the
add resistance. And you're going, this is like, somebody who has 90 degrees of elbow flexion block, and saying, well, great, we're just going to put 110 pounds in there and we're going to do repetitive through that range and it's going to improve your final range. You're going, no, it's not. It's just going to make you more stiff. So I would say 90% of the time you have to work on mobility first. And if you remember your pyramids, what you can apply to that is, you can apply manual therapy through the ribs and the thoracic spine. You can give them mobility exercise to be able to do. Then what you've done is you've created essentially a monster. You've got the mobility, but you've not strength or endurance and power on these things. So your training program has to switch over to establishing that. You may want to hypertrophize. You may want to be able to add strength. Essentially, in the end, you want to add power and endurance depending on the sport they're involved in. So this is where you get to the top, to the skill level that you're talking about, top of the pyramid, that you can apply specifically to them and be able to say, okay, this is what your training program should be. And it should be respiratory training programming should be based upon strength and conditioning guidelines. So all of mine, the reps, sets, load, are all part of my respiratory training. And I watch what's out there. And it's just, this is not right. You're telling everybody to do it. No population identification, and you're applying the same theory to everybody, and you don't know whether it's restrictive or whether it's a strength and power issue itself. And they always call it inspiratory muscle training, and you're going, no, a lot of people can't breathe out. A primary example that you guys will love is the fact that if you work in triathlon, those with swimming bases have no ability to expire. And you just as soon as I go with that, I say that, they go, oh yeah, how do they breathe out when they're in the water?
Yeah, it's a lot harder. Yeah.
They leave air in the lung to maintain buoyancy, to be able to allow them. So they never expire everything, and they breathe out very slowly and controlled. And then they have a head turn and they breathe in as much as they can during that time. So inspiration tends to be good, but not good volumes. But expiration tends to be their major limitation. So you find their FVC is good, but their FEV1's poor. So it's a lot of, if people ask me how I work, is I don't know what's going on. I have no idea until the data is in. And if you only have one source of data, you have no ability to cross-correlate to be able to determine what's going on. So in a lot of cases, if you got somebody with a respiratory limitation and they choose to hyperventilate, to be able to increase their VE during exercise, then that's going to have profound ramifications on the metabolic system's ability to use O2. It's complex. It's super complex what we do. And those that approach it in a very simple way aren't maximizing the data.
I think that's such a great point, because you're talking about silos earlier. I think people get siloed into one way of doing things, right? Mm-hmm. This is the only tool, or this is the best tool, or this is the tool that worked for me. It's like, that's very well and good, but like you're saying, if we're trying to find specific populations and kind of what's the lowest hanging fruit, right? Let's work on that and then move to the next thing, and then move to the next thing. And so being able to look at it from a variety of angles can just be so helpful in determining what's actually the major limitations, right? What's the next bottleneck? What's the next roadblock? And doing that. You know, I think one of the things that we miss is there's so many things we add, right? Do this, do that. We add a lot of gas to the car, but there's two ways you can go faster in your car, right? You can step on the gas, and you can also take your foot off the brake. And sometimes we're pushing hard on the brake and on the gas at the same time. We're lurching forward. And so I think using some of these tools, where can I take the brake off? And then where can I add in some things that will help them improve as well? It can be really helpful, especially for people that find that, I'm hitting a plateau, I'm not making any progress. Like, why can't I move to the next level? And being able to find some of those underlying things. So we've talked, here's how spirometry is helpful, right? Here's some of the things that it's helping me identify. In terms of what we're finding from the indirect calorimetry and then from the NIRS, how are you using those to all work together to supplement your findings and to confirm what you've found as well?
Well, as I stated, the metabolic analysis is the most important part. I couldn't do my job without it. I'm a firm believer in doing RMRs and VO2s. Some people, for some strange reason, like nutritionists want RMRs and don't understand the value of understanding fuel utilization during exercise. And then you've got your other people that don't understand why the RMR is important, not only for setting dietary recommendations, but also to look at their metabolic system's ability to work at rest. And if you take the time to look at the respiratory data, it's always interesting too. So I'm always paying attention to their average respiratory rate and their tidal volumes. And it's telling me a lot because obviously I'll use the RMR before I use the VO2. So my normal process is RMR, spirometry, and then VO2 testing in that order on a day, but everybody gets everything. I could go on for days about what I learned from metabolic analysis, but obviously the RMRs is, you think traditionally that's because of the fact I work from medical populations through to elite athletes, which is actually where you learn your stuff, is the ability to work across populations. If you can learn how an elite physiology works, it doesn't mean that you know how abnormal physiology works. And in fact, that's where you get really good, is working with people who have been diagnosed or not yet diagnosed, because in a lot of cases I pick up cardiovascular, respiratory, and metabolic disorders that other people have missed at this point. Even things like having hemoglobin issues, you can look at certain metrics and be able to determine that there may be an issue here. But from the VO2, everybody wants the number, and it's the least interesting thing to me.
Agreed. I say that all the time.
Oh, it says, here's your number. And you're going, but, to me, if you look down, I want to know how much work you could do at that, because really your outputs are important. One thing I do like about Core, it's forced me back into using METs, and I've started calculating, because of the fact that METs are transferable across genders and populations and different size of people. It's really nice number to be able to look at. It's always work output is related to it, which is really what most people want out of the whole thing. So it's fine to have an extremely high VO2 max, but if you're punching out 10.2 METs, that's abysmal. But well done, you've got a high VO2 max, but you've got to be able to produce work with it. But yeah, it's always about, and I blame a lot of cases is the social media side about, I appreciate the fact that VO2 max is the best predictor of longevity. Yeah, but do you understand what a high VO2 max means? And I see tons of people with high VO2 maxes that are extremely unhealthy.
Right.
And that's, and again, it's not us doing it. It's other people doing it to promote whatever the hell they're selling, or their belief structure. you don't see us running around saying this, is the fact that we know that it represents a lifestyle that's being represented in this number. You know, they generally are more active than other people. They generally are not overweight. They probably eat better, and have a better general lifestyle.
Right. So I've got an interesting example of that. So one time in grad school, actually, in my physical therapy program, the kid that tested right before I tested was a collegiate runner and was still like winning local 5Ks and 10Ks and stuff like that. But we're the same height and weight and age. And so he gets a 62 and I'm like, well, then I'm going to get a 62. And I did. The difference was he hopped off the treadmill and was totally fine and was like, ooh, that was tough. I was white as a ghost. Like they had to check my blood sugar. I had to lay down for like 45 minutes before I could do anything. Like I was able to mentally force myself to keep going until I got the 62. Whereas if he had pushed himself to that same level of exhaustion, he would have had much higher than 62. So the number isn't really as telling as the capacity. If we had gone and done a road race, he would have smoked me by minutes, you know, in a mile. He would have smoked me by minutes. And so, yeah, that number just doesn't really tell performance or capacity per se. So anyway, just kind of a funny anecdote of what that number doesn't mean.
I know, and I try not to be a grump, because I do appreciate the fact that it's nice that this is being said, and I do appreciate those people out and talking about, you know, the importance of doing zone 2 after we've been killed with high intensity interval training for years.
Yeah.
So and
Agreed.
and I was one of the very first CrossFit coaches in Canada, because I was working with special operations at the time. And I remember sitting this was being delivered by Coach Glassman himself, because that's how small they were at the time. And I remember sitting in a class, and just like my head's just dropping with every time he said something wrong about physiology. And it was sort of like, you know, I put my hand up and I said, I don't mean to be a dick, but I'm not concerned about your feelings, but I'm worried about everybody else in this room who's hearing wrong physiology being espoused here. And I have to give him credit. He said, great, come up here, sit with me, and every time I say something wrong, you interject. And I went, wow. I said, okay. And so we went out for dinner that night, and it started off our relationship was, you know, why they developed a cardiovascular side was conversations with me going, no, this is not, you know, you can't do everything with what you're doing, and you can't call it functional when it's obvious. Nobody needs to go do 150 air squats in a row. That's not functional. Right. So right.
Nobody's kipping a pull-up 100 times. Yeah.
It's you know, being around as long as I have, is you've watched all this. Now I see lactate coming back, and I'm just going, no, you know, and now I see, you know, people advertising on social media. Yeah, here's some software you can use that you can fully extrapolate the data from a lactate test. And you go, you can't. You're looking for 1 point. You're looking for a rapid increase in lactate accumulation, which doesn't really mean anything anyway. You're stating this represents hydrogen ion accumulation. That's it. But to state that you can get anything else from that test is unfair. And we know the reason behind it is because it's cheap, and coaches can pretend they're doing science and state that there's something behind it. And you're going, but there's not. And, you know, the fact is that, you know, you've got other people now entering the metabolic analysis world, and they're not being truthful about what they're actually measuring or what methods that they're using to deal with the inaccuracies of their devices. And I that really upsets me. I know we've gotten kind of off topic about what I get from metabolic analysis, so I'll try and bring it back to it. But you know, you with certain devices, you can get really good respiratory data. So to tie that together with spirometry, if you don't have VT and BF, all you've got is VE. And I've been, there's a lot of people using my terminology now. There's good VE and there's bad VE. Don't use VE, because if you hyperventilate at low volumes, you're still going to have a good VE. So which is innately bad for exercise, for you to be able to exercise well. So you can't run around hyperventilating and using low volumes and survive well, because it affects not only your metabolic system, but it also affects your cardiovascular system, and it changes how everything works. So breathing has a huge effect on things. So I love the fact that we're one of the devices that provides really accurate VE and breathing frequency. The other thing is obviously fuel consumption with the O2 and CO2. There's other devices out there now that have only O2. They've been promising CO2 for 7 years. They'll never happen. The fact is, you need both of those. You need O2 and CO2 metrics to measure fuel, fat and carbohydrate utilization. And I couldn't survive without it, because the way I zone is I don't use percentages of anything. I'm just allergic to math. It just bothers me.
That's a great way of saying that.
It just, why have all this scientific data then use math? It just doesn't make any sense to me. So I couldn't zone without it. I couldn't identify limiters. So like I said, cardiovascular, metabolic, and respiratory. And those three systems, you get a very good output from each one of them with metabolic testing, that you can actually determine which is the major limiter and what's a minor limiter, what's being affected by this as well. So you can see, if you're good enough at this, you can see other systems being negatively affected by a limitation at one of the three. Most cases, like you were saying, everybody's got a limiter. Your job is to prescribe nutrition and exercise based upon the limitations you find in a right priority. And that's probably one of the most important things, is what needs to change first. And if you don't do it in the right order, it's not going to work. And you're going to waste people's time and their effort. But to be able to identify which limitation needs to be changed, you should know physiologically how long it takes for those changes to happen. And some of them can happen very quickly. I find metabolic changes with appropriate training zones and application can change significantly in 8 to 12 weeks. You're not going to increase capillarization and mitochondrial density in that period of time, but you're going to get the systems working better. And so that's what you're going to see. It's like going to the gym and you're doing weights and you go, oh my God, in the first 2 weeks, did I ever make some great gains? No, you just found out how to use what you had better. And that's that first set of gains. Whereas, your expectation of a change over time should be significantly different. But if you burn fat and carbohydrate better, your zones can change by 20 beats in 8 to 12 weeks. And therefore, your zones aren't your zones. Your zones are your zones now.
Right.
And by applying the right training, they'll change significantly. So I use the metabolic analysis for zoning, system limitation, identification. And without that, I couldn't possibly decide what my nutrition and training approaches would be until I get to that point. But you should always have an answer for everything you find. And a lot of people don't. A lot of people use even our device and have no idea about respiratory limitations. They have no idea about respiratory training. So if they want to maximize the benefits of the testing, they really need an answer to whatever they find. So I could not possibly do my job without having metabolic analysis with O2 and CO2 to have accurate data and be able to then appropriately prescribe.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, well, really quick, I'm so excited to have you on the show a few more times. Like my
Yeah,
mind
there's so
is
much to
racing,
ask.
right? My mind is racing about things like I would love to have just a few demo tests that we go through and do that as an episode where we go through that together. Like have you analyze those tests because I would love to see your methods and methodology and how to do that. And you know, I've got so many ideas of different conversations that I'd love to have with you. And so. I'm excited about this. So Daniel will be a regular on the podcast for sure.
Definitely.
So,
No, a wealth of knowledge and so much good material for future episodes.
And I love geeking out about this stuff, so so fun.
Absolutely.
It's a passion, that's for sure. And you just I'm constantly amazed with working with people and how much some people are concerned about being tested and from their personalities themselves. And I said it's not a test you can fail. But if you want to maximize your health or performance, and that's why I defined my company as it's had various names before, but really it's health and performance side of the house. Is you've got to know what's going on, and and the reason why. Well, people say, well, I've been on a diet and I've done exercise, it doesn't work for me. And you're going, you are not a pig, you're a human. Physiology, as long as your physiology is normal, meaning that you have not gone over to the disease side, then you will respond, but you have not done the right nutrition and the right exercise. And I hate it when the two best approaches that we have are not being used properly, and people think that they're outside that grouping, and you're not. But without the testing for the medical community, you can't possibly know what intensity they need to work at. From a medical point of view, it doesn't matter if you're a cardiovascular, you're coming back from a cardiovascular incident, or whether you have had diabetes or have diabetes, or you're pre-diabetic, or whether you have COPD, it doesn't matter. Get in, get tested, and then the right parameters can be given to you to maximize the results of the approaches that we have, because we know they do work on everybody.
So one of my goals that I always talk to people about when they come in, because most people that come in to get tested have, not all, but most have some basis in exercise. They've tried exercise and things. And I always say my number one goal today is to help you match your fitness effort to your fitness goal. Because oftentimes what we see is what they're doing for their fitness does not match up with what they're trying to accomplish. And I feel like CPET, metabolic testing, is that key in helping me to see where they're at, what they've been doing, and then how we can help them switch what they're doing to what will line up with what they'd like to accomplish.
Well, in fact, what I love doing is people say, they start talking to me and say, so this is what I've been doing for training. I said, no, I'll tell you what you've been doing.
Yeah, exactly. I love it.
This tells the story.
Right. I can tell you the story. Yeah.
That's where you've been training is between these two heart rates on if you use VO2 pulse or you use, I use a totally different metric that doesn't officially exist, which is VO2 over BF, which is the same representation of ability to use oxygen per breath. Mm-hmm. For some reason, when VO2 pulse caught on about 10 years ago, and I've been using it for about 20 years, it's a good one, including the peak metric as well. So what's their number and what's their trend line like? And let's face it, your highest numbers are going to be where you've been doing your training. And it just shows that you've done a very good job training in zone 3, which is not where you should have trained. And, you're just going, most of the time, the biggest issue I have with zone 2 is I know most people's zone 2 is wrong. And there's only one way to accurately zone, and that's through metabolic analysis. And this will just I mean, this is what one of the questions that I saw coming up, and I'm always smiling to it, is I don't zone like anybody else because of the fact that I have different, there's different metrics that we should be paying attention to based upon the production of ATP. You know, there's the first two are fuel based, so it should be fuel based. That's your analysis of it. Your zoning should be there. The rest of them are based upon getting rid of the byproducts associated with it. Yep. And you know, so therefore it should be based upon the body's normal response, which is respiratory frequency. And it should be based upon elevations in respiratory frequency. Now, what screws things up now is there's so many people doing nasal breathing for some strange reason, or trying to breathe really slowly in zone 3 and 4 and mess.
Yeah.
Oh, it just drives me nuts. And what's terrible is I trained a couple of these people and they've gone on to do evil.
The dark side. They went to the dark side.
And now I hear them discussing, you know, my favorite pet peeve right now is CO2 tolerance. I'm going, what are you talking about? You know, why would we, first of all, if you could increase CO2 tolerance, why would you want to do it?
Yeah.
And CO2 tolerance is, okay, the only way you can increase CO2 tolerance is to dampen your mechano and chemoreceptors from reading CO2. Why the hell would you want to do that? Because it's your best indicator that you're going acidotic. And people just don't know their physiology well enough to be able to realize that that's there's no such thing. You guys just sat in a boardroom one day, decided to make up a term, and the rest of us are scrambling around going, that doesn't exist. You know, you guys are old enough to remember O2 debt, you know, and that doesn't exist.
Oxygen debt.
Heart rate drift. And you're going, no, there's no such thing as heart rate drift. If your load is set at a level that requires it to go up to be able to deal with proper circulation, it's not a drift, it's a response. So it's just, you know, you're constantly trying to stop these different terminologies. And I am fervently against right now people representing what they do as being the equivalent of what our device does. And I think, you know, we've been in this business for 30 years. It's a family business designed originally. It hasn't really changed significantly because it did what it was supposed to do in the first place. And we don't run around exaggerating the capabilities of what the data provides you. And, you know, to have a business that survives through the onslaught of these other companies coming in, trying to make a quick buck and promising the world.
Telling you your brain health and your kidney health and your whatever from your breathing is wild. Yeah.
It's no need when it does so many good things. You don't need to exaggerate. What we get to do, and one of the things I'm proud of, you guys are sales, right?
I am, yeah.
Have you ever seen a sales group that has so much actual experience in the profession? You know, I always tell people, when you talk to the salespeople, these aren't just guys hired every 6 weeks to come in and try and schlock wares. We are physiologists that work in the field and have been doing testing for years, and we're here because we believe in the product.
I think that's huge. I've been testing since 2008, something like that, 2007, 2008. It's been a minute. I've owned a core device since 2012. So like I've been testing with their devices for a long time, but I've been testing for a bit now, and you quite a bit longer than that. But yeah, that's rare for a sales team to have true experts in the field also helping you decide if this is going to be the right choice for your business or not.
Yeah, and one thing I always try to get across to them is my first device was Cosbed. I'm very good friends with VO2 Master. Jurg Feldman, the gentleman that I started off with, we had a group, and it's all the same people. One of the main creators of VO2 Masters was a 16-year-old kid that was working algorithms back in the day when we were working together. That's awesome. And obviously I did 2 years with Pinoy. I came back. I worked with K5. I worked with Cosmed. So I've worked with all the other devices that are out there. And it's hard to be the honest broker for people, but that's the one thing I try and be is, people are still friends with me that bought Pinoy based upon my recommendation, and I thank them for still being my friends. But you want to be the honest broker out there. If this is not the right thing for you, you want to know that you'll be told that you'll be pointed in the right direction. It is an honor to work for a company that is so supportive, not only of its people that work within the company itself, but of the users, because they're part of the family, and they're treated extremely well, and they stand behind the product. So I know it sounds a bit like propaganda, but it's when you reach my age and you've been this long in the field, you kind of really learn to appreciate that side. If it sounds like too good of a deal, it probably is. And I think what we do is we provide expertise and a high quality, just standing on a high quality product. It's easy to do.
Yeah, it is.
Love that perspective. Well, again, so much for future episodes, but we appreciate you so much for joining us today. A lot of good stuff. We'll look forward to future conversations with you. Real quick, if people want to find out more about you or follow you, where can they go?
LinkedIn is probably the best. I'm not the best at all the other stuff, Facebook, Instagram. I'm really not present there. I am more on the LinkedIn side of the house. Or you can reach out to me, Strategic Health and Performance. So you can reach out through my website itself. It's www.strategichealthperformance.com. And otherwise, you can reach out to me through Core as being the director of sales for Europe and Africa.
Fantastic. So again, awesome. Daniel Crumback, Strategic Health and Performance. Hope you enjoyed this episode. As always, remember to like, follow, and subscribe to get more content like this. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time.